Going to go ahead and get started. So thank you to everyone who joined us today for the Global Ethics Month discussion on reopening schools during the pandemic. My name is Nehali. I am a junior public policy major and econ major at UNC, and this is my third semester as an intern with the Office of Ethics and Policy. So just before we get started, I'm going to go over a couple of logistics for tonight. Firstly, we are going to be recording the panel tonight, and it's going to be posted on the Office of Ethics and Policy's YouTube and various social media channels afterwards. And then towards the end of the panel, we're going to have a short audience Q&A. So if you have a question at any point during the discussion, you can use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen, and it will be passed on to the panelists during that time. So one more thing before we get started, I'm going to introduce tonight's panelists. So first we have Dr. Dana Griffin. She is an associate professor at the UNC School of Education. She researches parent involvement and school family community partnerships. She believes that collaboration can be better achieved when school stakeholders are multiculturally competent, aware of their biases and preconceived beliefs, and understand the different complexities of families and parenting. She also researches inequality issues in education. Next, we have Dr. Jim Thomas, an associate professor at the UNC Gilling School of Public Health. His work in public health has spanned 35 years and 25 countries. His principal interests are in the social forces that underlie epidemics, ethical concerns in digital surveillance, and the ethical practice of public health in a pandemic. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, he has been advising government planning groups, speaking and writing on pandemic ethics, and has created an online pandemic ethics dashboard as a resource for policymakers. Next, we have Dr. Paula Mcavoy. She is an assistant professor at the NC State College of Education. Her research focuses on philosophical and empirical questions about the relationship between schools and democratic society, and addresses the questions of what educational aims and practices are the most appropriate for preparing young people for living within a democratic society, and kind of what ethical challenges teachers encounter when they engage students in discussing controversial political issues. And last but not least, we have Dr. Chris Marcicano, an assistant professor of the practice of educational studies at Davidson College. His research focuses on higher education policy and finance, the politics of education, public management, and civic engagement. He looks at higher education institutions as political actors and the outcomes associated with their attempts to impact the political process. And on top of that, he is also the director and principal investigator of the College Crisis Initiative, which tracks college and university responses to the COVID-19 global pandemic. So now we're going to start kind of looking at the main portion of our panel. The main focus of our discussion tonight is going to be the results of different decisions to open both higher education and K-12 institutions in the fall. We're going to be looking at what went into these decisions and kind of just discussing what went well and what maybe didn't go so well. So without further ado, we can move into our questions. So the first one is, what factors do you think educational institutions considered this fall when making the decision to reopen? How will these criteria change as administrations look at how to reopen in the spring? Dr. Thomas, do you want to start us off?
Sure, let me just make sure that I am heard. Okay, good. Well, so one of the things that I have noticed, I'm going to speak particularly of UNC. I'm aware of other universities and other campuses, but particularly at UNC because I've been engaged in that process. And one of the things that I have noted is that they have been leaning pretty heavily on the epidemiology and the biology of the epidemic and less on the social factors. There is a common frequent reference to the infectious disease experts, but one of those experts mentioned in a talk after UNC experienced a not so smooth reopening and then sending students back. This expert said, well, we couldn't have anticipated that the students would have behaved in the way they did. And I think we could have, and there is plenty of actually research that would indicate that, and writing in the media about it. So there is a bias towards thinking about the biology and not thinking about the rest of the considerations.
Awesome. And for Dr. Griffin or Dr. McAvoy, do you think that the factors that kind of we talked about in higher education are different for K through 12 schools?
Do you want to go, Dr. Griffin? I'll defer to
you. I agree, you know, thinking about students, and also that there's disagreement in how we respond to what's happening. Those are things that we have to think about too, that some families are more aware of behaviors, you know, following the CDC guidelines. And then there are some who don't, you know, we don't need to wear a mask, or we don't need to socially distant. And so we have to take those things into consideration when thinking about going back to schools. And that's, you know, what we had to deal with coming on college campuses, that yes, there were students who, you know, going back to UNC, you know, we saw the videos and the pictures of them congregating and, you know, out having fun, doing what college kids do. But then there were also those who, you know, were in their dorms and they remained socially distant and they followed the guidelines set by the university. But we do have to take into account that there are going to be those with all mindsets who are going to be funneled into the schools when we think about making these decisions.
I think I would add at the K-12 level, I think, you know, a lot changes when you think about minors and young people who need adult supervision, for whom online learning might not be developmentally appropriate, that there's food scarcity issues, there's access issues. And so I think the community needs become much greater at the K-12 level. Higher ed is thinking about young adults who have much more independent lives than the children in K-12. And so I think certainly experts should and did factor into the equation for schools, but I think that the stakes got a little higher in a lot of ways at K-12, just because the well-being of young children is much harder to address in this situation.
Could I add to this?
Yes.
There are some. So what we're likely to do is to focus on some sort of narrow ethical questions or questions about how things are handled. And there are some backdrops to all of this that I think need to be mentioned that will affect everything we think about, everything that we're touching in this conversation. One of them is the rising and falling of the prevalence rates in the communities, in the states, in the countries that we are living in. And there were decisions made about schools at the college level, at the K-12 level, in the spring of last year, or of this year rather, about the fall, because schools have to plan that far in advance. And at the time, the rates in the state were on the decrease, and it seemed like a safe thing to do. But then they bounced back up and started to climb, and we stuck with our plans. And it's been shown that virtually anything that you do to control or even to make decisions, decisions turn into no wins when the rates are so high. You pay a price by keeping everybody at home. You pay a price by bringing them together. So that's one backdrop that I want to mention. The other backdrop is the political polarization that we're facing and the different narratives that people are bringing to this whole experience that cause them to behave and sometimes angrily in ways that are not productive to disease control. Those are the two background things that I would mention. I have other things that I'll save for later in our discussion.
I'd like to jump in on that as well. The College Crisis Initiative is going to release a report later this week that's going to show that college reopening plans are correlated with certain political dynamics in a state. So I want to second Dr. Thomas's suggestion that the politics matters here. I also think, back to Nahali's question about the differences between higher ed and K-12, there's a couple of other fundamental differences when we're talking about major universities like NC State or Carolina, or liberal arts colleges of national renown like Davidson College. You're bringing students from all over the country to your campus. So what you're doing is you are connecting not just with one community's COVID case count, but the community's COVID case count across the country. That's not necessarily the case in K-12. And another factor for K-12 that I think is very different from higher ed is that the childcare component of this that Dr. McAvoy mentioned is huge for the local economy. It is hard for parents to get back to work if they have to be at home making sure that their children are on Zoom. And so there's some economic issues around this as well that I hope we delve into today. And then one final difference is that higher education institutions, by and large, especially public institutions as compared to K-12 institutions, are at least in some part responsible for their own revenue. So tuition and all of the auxiliary revenues from football and dining and having weddings in the college chapel, all of those things certainly play a role here where they might not necessarily play a role in K-12, which is funded at government levels. Not that higher ed isn't, we still have state appropriations, but those state appropriations have just now recovered from pre-recession to pre-recession levels, and we'll see if they can continue to stay strong. I have serious concerns about that. But I'll stop talking because I think Nahali's doing a great job moderating this, and I want to turn it back over to her.
Well, actually, my next question was very much related to what you were just talking about. So how should schools that cannot financially withstand another remote semester be thinking about the reopening decision, and kind of what are the other financial and economic implications of this reopening or not reopening in case, maybe?
You know, one question I had about that is that should that even be in decision-making process, the finances? And I know it's easy for me to sit on my side, you know, when I'm okay and, you know, I'm having all of my basic needs met. So it's easy for me to say that. But, you know, thinking about sports and the revenue that, you know, schools bring in, I also think about the people who are playing these sports and we're putting them at risk, right? So that we can continue to increase revenue. Should that even be a decision? So we're placing our well-being on the backs of students themselves, students often who are from marginalized populations. That's just a question that I have. It's a difficult question. And like Dr. Thomas mentioned, you know, there is no win-win. We're all in a lose-lose situation, but I still have to think about, when we think about ethical decision-making, you know, what's just and what's fair, and who do we consider when we make these decisions? And focusing on finances only, I think, does eliminate certain groups from this conversation when we talk about that.
I'd like to jump in and back support Dr. Griffin here and add a little bit. I think when we talk about these auxiliary revenues, especially when we talk about sports and athletics, we have to remember that not every institution has a Division I football team like the Carolina Tar Heels, right? That most institutions that have football teams, the revenue is not coming from a great TV contract from the ACC network. It's coming from the fact that without those teams, students would not enroll, right? So if you have 50 football players, that's 50 enrollments, 50 tuitions. And for a lot of institutions, they rely on college athletics to even stay open. And that brings me to my next point, is that we're all very fortunate, the faculty on this call, to work in institutions that are financially fairly strong, at least compared to other institutions. There are institutions out there that are 3 tuitions away from shutting down. And if they're not opening in person, then they won't exist next year. Then those students won't have anywhere to go next year. And so the stakes are exceptionally high for so many institutions around whether to be in person financially for their future, you know, their survival, let alone for students' futures and survivals.
Okay, I'm going to chime in now. Paula, were you unmuted? You want to go?
I was, but I will be talking totally out of my depth. So why don't you go first?
Let me talk out of my depth then. So here's another one of the background issues that I wanted to mention, and it's what I refer to as downstream ethics. That we're facing decisions now that appear to be either or decisions. I would argue they're not either ors. They're much more of a mix than that. But these are highly emotional, high stakes ethical issues. And one of the reasons that we are facing them is because ethical steps were not taken earlier. And these are earlier steps of disease control that are countrywide. When you look at rates of infection in the US compared to the rest of the world, we have close to the highest rates in the world. And so because the rates have remained high, and thinking back on the comment that I made a while back, that when the rates of a community are high, then you don't really have any good options. That's where we are living right now. So it's having a devastating impact on the economies of these schools. And the ethics guidance that exists coming out of WHO and other places says that it's legitimate to consider these economic aspects. They shouldn't just be taken off the table. But I think that there are things that we can do that are, shall we call, half measures that will allow institutions to remain open, but not significantly increase the risk. We're doing some of that right now, on Zoom. So there is some of that, some of these middle steps that can be taken. Then the last thing that I want to say, and maybe one of the others of you would have more to say about this, is that if you look back over the expense of colleges and universities over the last 20, 30 years, they have risen quite sharply. And I'm not an expert on this. This is where I'm out of my depth, but I have noticed that the administrations of universities have gotten quite large. The number of experts on administrative staff have increased in number. And so I do wonder how much of the economic costs of our universities should we be trying to maintain? Are there costs that rightly should be scaled back?
I'm happy to talk about sort of cost drivers in higher education. Administrative bloat is often a reason given for that. I don't necessarily think that is the main reason. To me, from my research and reading the work of people like David Feldman, what I see as the main issues with cost drivers in higher education are a lack of strong public appropriations. Appropriations to places like Carolina and NC State. I think a lot of it is that it's really, really hard and really expensive to educate PhDs, to educate high quality faculty. And so the cost of developing and hiring your labor force in higher education is ever increasing. And there are fewer efficiency gains that we can get that maintain the same experience. So as a result of that, when there are fewer efficiency gains, it makes it difficult to sort of bring down the costs. But I agree with you, Dr. Thomas. I mean, what we're doing right now, this is the kind of panel that where I would have driven up to Chapel Hill to do in normal times with a big crowd, and we're mitigating the risk as a result of doing this online. I do want to mention, though, that institutions are having varying different levels of success, certainly at the higher education level here. There are institutions that have large numbers of cases. I think about a lot of our large state institutions. The University of Georgia, for instance, has a large number of cases. The University of Wisconsin right now is really struggling with its case counts. But we also have a lot of other institutions, particularly small colleges like Bowdoin College or HBCUs. In particular, that have done exceptionally well with maintaining the case counts low. And many of those institutions have 0 case counts at this point. And we know that not because they're testing symptomatic people, but because they're testing everyone. At Davidson, we test every single student every week. And we've been able to get that number down to 0. And so there, as we talked earlier about the financial ethics and the financial ramifications of this, that costs a lot of money to do. We're able to have students in person because we're spending a lot of money on testing, we're spending a lot of money on tracing, and we're able to keep students in isolation and quarantine to stop the spread. Unless state governments are willing to appropriate that level of funding to public institutions, we are going to continue to have an increase in the cost of higher education, which is a long-term systemic issue, but also we're going to have an increase in cases until we can get the kind of testing we need at public institutions to maintain small numbers of cases. I think of the University of Illinois as a great example of this. They developed their own test, and now 1 in 50 tests in America, not 1 in 50 tests in American higher education, 1 in 50 tests in America happens at the University of Illinois now. So as institutions, we can take a leadership role in providing the public health guidance that we need and the public health requirements that we need to stop the spread of this virus across the country.
Dr. McAvoy, I know you had a point that you were going to make earlier.
Well, so much related, but to state the obvious, I think one of the problems that the question sort of suggests or points out to is that we have had a lack of real leadership at the national level and often at the state levels on how to think about some issues like, in this situation, we might need to rethink how we fund K-12 schools, how we fund higher public institutions of higher education. And if we want to prioritize schooling, we might have to reallocate and rethink and spend more money to do the things that would, like testing more students in public universities, or how we think about how we fund K-12 schools. North Carolina's had a great increase in homeschooling requests and people registering as homeschoolers, which then is going to, because of the way we fund, is now going to draw money out of the public schools just when they actually need more money. And so we need some leadership at the state level to not put institutions into this sort of lose-lose situation and think nationally, is this who are we going to bail out is one way to think about it. It's like, do we care more about corporate jobs and bailout, or are we caring more about education from K on up? So again, stating the obvious, but more direct leadership may have been helpful.
All right, and kind of shifting gears a little bit, how did this decision to reopen, especially K-12 schools, affect younger students and K-12 teachers? And how are teachers kind of handling this in their classroom, and how are younger students coping?
Dr. Griffin, I mean, I have a few. You want me to start
You can go.
You probably know more about this. I mean, I think that that's such a hard question because it has been a completely different story at every school and district level. And so, how are kids coping? Some kids thriving, some kids completely disconnected from school and have not shown up. And we don't know what's happening with them. And so there's just a complete, this is just a big unknown, I think, and what we do know doesn't look pretty a lot of the times is that we have kids facing, as I said earlier, food scarcity, little adult supervision, maybe if they can get online to even have an adult that they can get support from. So there's just, you're seeing some evidence of more anxiety, more depression with young people. But I think that the bottom line is that the story is that it's a story of social class. It's a story of rural versus urban, and well-off kids in the suburbs and cities are doing okay, and other kids are not doing okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything to really, you're exactly right. And I do know initial numbers coming out of this is that suicide has actually been on the rise now with kids. So they're not getting the access to mental health care that they need. But I mean, it's just like you said, we have some kids who are thriving and then we have those who aren't. And you know, I know a lot of people with young kids at home, and I know that has been very difficult to try to keep them engaged in an online environment. I feel lucky. I have a middle schooler and he hates it, but I don't have to stay on top of him. So I feel a little bit privileged in that he's older, he's a little bit more self-sufficient. You know, he can cook his own lunch. I'm just like, do your thing, you know. And he, you know, I check in on him, make sure I, you know, log into Canvas. But again, that's a privilege that I have to do that we don't think about, other parents don't have. And you know, the rural aspect, and some parents are not able to help their kids with work. So I think the ramifications of this is going to be huge, and schools are going to have to start thinking about a way to address this when this is all over, because there are going to be so many needs. Some kids are like the gap that we already know exists. And I'm not calling it an achievement gap. I like to use Gorski's term, and the opportunity gap. Like, some kids do not have access, and those kids are going to continue to fall behind because of so many different factors. And even if they are able to get access to, you know, the internet, and they're working with their teachers, are there people at home who can help? You know, again, my son, my husband is a math teacher. So if he has trouble with math, I have someone in the house who can help, right? I got the other part covered, you know, or I have resources. I know where we could go to get that support. And there's so many who don't have that support. And so when we think about coping, you know, kids aren't coping, some are coping, parents, you know, the mental stress on parent is something that we need to think about. And the mental stress on teachers as well, because we are asking a lot, we're doing more, it takes more to plan, to, you know, plan lessons and to teach lessons in this environment and to really prepare. And we're expecting the same level of work without any concessions to how this plays out in this online environment. And so when we think about mental health and coping, it's all of us, it's parents, it's teachers, it's, you know, the students. And I think there are going to be long-term consequences for that we're going to need to be prepared for.
And I guess kind of going off of that, are there any practices from online school that teachers are likely to stick with, maybe following the pandemic, and how are they kind of preparing to deal with the ramifications that are going to come from this?
I mean, I think one, teachers who, I adore teachers, I'm a big fan of K-12, but a lot of teachers, I think what this showed, this pandemic brought to light immediately was that a lot of teachers have long resisted adapting technologies in the classroom. And, you know, you had teachers that had already been using things like Google Classroom and had an easier time transitioning to online, and some teachers who had never opened it or thought about it. And so it could be that teachers have been forced to use a set of tools that are now going to become more naturally incorporated into the classroom, perhaps. Or perhaps they're going to be so sick of those online tools that they don't want to use them anymore. But so there's things like that. But I do think one thing that I think about as a teacher, or a former teacher and now faculty member, is that there is an opportunity here to really rethink how we do teaching and learning, and the amount of time that we, you know, just how we grade, how we think about what learning is, how do we cover content, you know, should we be covering content or doing more project-based things? Should we, how much interaction do we want to have with students? How much free time do kids need? Like, all of this, there's an opportunity here to really reimagine a school, because schools have kind of looked the same way for about 100 years. And this could be you know, a big game changer for the long run, but we have yet to, you know, we'll see what happens.
You know, my hope is that teachers now also start to look at parents from oppressed groups in different light. So before, there was a deficit approach to parent and parent involvement. And now I hope that they get a glimpse into what some of their home lives are like and what's happening at home, and start to adapt or shift their mindset around what parent involvement looks like and what it means. That is my hope, that that's something that will change. And so that when we start to come back in, it's, when I say come back in, go back to school, it's more of a understanding and of developing new strategies of how to really work with parents, the ones that they may not see, the ones that they can't get to come into the school, you know, during the regular school hours. So I do hope that there's more acceptance of, you know, what kids are going through at home.
Does the fact that we're living in an internet age now provide an opportunity to see children's environments and interact with their parents more than 25 years ago?
Yeah,
Yes?
yeah, is that a question? Yeah, I think
Yeah,
no, but it's also at the same time brought up a lot of puzzling situations of like, should you be able to require a child to turn on their video camera in a Zoom? I hear teachers say, I literally don't know what the kids in my classroom look like because the school won't allow us to require cameras on, and they don't require, they make that policy because they don't want students to feel like they've had to expose their home to their classmates and their teacher if they don't want to. Or safety issues of districts saying you're not allowed to use breakout rooms on Zoom. You have to keep everybody in the same room and, you know, the same video room. And I can't even comprehend how you would teach in that way without being able to move students around into smaller groups. So, and then there's ethical issues for teachers because now parents can look into the teacher's home. And so I'm going to be on the panel next week or later this week about a parent who complained that you could see a crucifix in the background of the teacher, and is that a violation of church and state? Or social studies teachers who are now being heard talking about the election, and parents questioning are they being fair or unbiased in how they're dealing with that, or bringing up issues like current events and Black Lives Matter in a classroom. Now parents can hear that and have opinions about it. So it has created, just the ability to see into each other's spaces has created a lot of interesting problems or dilemmas.
And I think the question too, you mentioned internet and access. I don't know if there's increased communication happening, meaning, for instance, I haven't had an opportunity. I guess I could email. I know I could email, but have there been more opportunities to have parent-teacher conferences, right? I don't know if that's happening. I remember face-to-face, there's open house, right? I didn't get an open house this year. And so, and it was online, so there was no chance to really ask. So I don't know if having us in this virtual environment means that there's increased communication between parents and teachers, but yeah, I mean, we could see each other, like there's an opportunity for parents to be there to hear what's happening, but I still think there's a difference in what's, the communication that may be needed.
And another kind of element of this, especially in higher education, involves international students and how can higher education protect the needs of those international students, and how have they been affected so far?
I am happy to jump in on this one if y'all will indulge me. Just a little bit of background on me. When the Trump administration announced the student ban, that seems like years ago, but was just only a few months ago because of 2020, y'all. When the Trump administration announced that institutions would have to have in-person classes in order to have international students, Harvard, MIT, and others sued. There was a negotiation and effectively a situation whereby international students who were already resident in the country could stay, provided they were enrolled in an institution. That didn't necessarily affect students who were already abroad. And this past week, we've seen changes to or proposed changes to visa restrictions from the Department of Homeland Security. There's a comment period going on now. So if you care passionately about this issue, it's a good time to register your comments. But the restrictions would basically say an indefinite amount of time where students could stay as long as they're pursuing an education or transitioning into a new job status. That period of time would be condensed to about 2 years. And so the major threats to international students who want to be resident in the United States seem to be administrative and policy rather than COVID-19. Which is an interesting situation to be in. For those international students who have chosen to remain abroad and take their classes online, it dramatically changes the way professors in higher education can teach. I had 2 students in one of my courses last spring who were 13 hours and 14 hours ahead of Davidson, North Carolina and Eastern Standard Time at the time, which meant that it was very, very hard to have synchronous education, which meant that they could not come to our class because at 1 o'clock in the afternoon would have been 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning where they were. And so what that meant was that faculty had to be more flexible. I had to be more flexible and meet with them in the mornings at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. Eastern time, just to make sure to get a chance to meet with them. So we're teaching the class effectively twice. And so what has happened as a result of this is international students who cannot come into the country, whether because their governments say, don't go to the US right now, it's not a good place to be in terms of case counts, whether it's because of visa restrictions, or whether it's because of personal choice, are faced with the choice of asynchronous online courses or online courses that take a lot more time and effort than would necessarily have to be in an in-person setting. So that, I think the biggest changes for international students, again, to sort of wrap this in a bow, are related to policy and visa restrictions, not necessarily COVID-19, because if we could solve those policy issues, we could get those international students to the United States and into institutions that, if they have strong testing, if they can control the flow of people on campus, can keep those international students safe. Not COVID-19 in and of itself. The challenges are more policy than they are disease related.
And you all teach classes and have been like throughout the pandemic. So are there any practices from online classes that you think that you're going to keep sticking with even after, or are you kind of ready to move back into normal classes?
I'll confess that. So I love classroom teaching. I was a high school teacher for a long time and now in higher education. And I long resisted online learning, period. And this has been the trend in higher education for some time now, is to try, especially for professional programs like pre-service teaching, et cetera. And so I'm teaching my first synchronous classes this semester. And I have to say, it's not as bad as I thought. So I think with like, the technology, the tool, I keep saying, imagine that if this pandemic happened 10 years ago, like we would not have the technology to operate very well at all. But right now we have a lot of tools at our fingertips, and you can do a lot with them. And so I don't think that my students are getting a worse education because we are synchronous online. We're losing out on some of the interpersonal, some, not all. My classes are thankfully pretty small. So I can see that I will probably be asked to teach more online in the future, and I will be a little bit less resistant to that.
So I was an early adopter of the technologies for teaching, and gosh, it was about 15 years ago that I put together an online course on global health ethics and recorded them all. They were taught asynchronously, and but what I really thrive on is being in a room with people and the give and take with them. The style of teaching I like. Now I'm talking at a college level, and even beyond that, I teach graduate students. So the type of teaching I enjoy is to give people enough information that's new to them to be able to engage in a debate and a discussion, and to bring their personal backgrounds into that discussion, and And then we have at it. We have really very interesting discussions, and often highly cross-cultural. I just love that, and I can't evoke that on the internet. I think it was you, Paula, who was mentioning earlier the challenge of keeping everybody in the same virtual room and not having breakout rooms. And I think people they're just, some people are free to talk. They talk freely on a Zoom call like this, and others who just go quiet. And in a classroom situation, I can do other tricks to get people involved, and I don't find the online version as enjoyable.
I'm a newbie to online teaching, and I'm a counselor. I teach counselor education courses, and so we do a lot of interpersonal work and theory training, and our classes are discussion based. And like Dr. Thomas, I'm teaching a course on diversity now, and it is very I don't know if my students are getting the same level of engagement. I don't know if they're learning what I would want them to learn. This is my first time. I had to see what the evaluations say. I don't know if I would volunteer to teach online if I didn't have to. Now, I say that saying that when the university made it a choice if we wanted to go hybrid or face-to-face, I definitely chose to do full online just because of COVID. I was like, I don't want to teach in that environment. But if I had a choice, I would definitely choose to teach face-to-face, but I would definitely integrate the technologies, I think, into this. I took a class, the School of Education, we were able to take a class on how to develop and use technology based on our pedagogies. And so that was very helpful. I don't know if every faculty member was able to do that. It was very helpful for me and my colleagues. I don't know. I look at my students' faces and I wonder if they're engaged. I wonder if they're, present. I wonder if they're just tired and over Zoom. I teach undergrads and graduate students, and my Thursday classes, I think they're done. By the end of the week, they are done, and I feel that they are just not there. I've reached out to them, and I say, I'm based on your face, based on your facial expressions, I can't tell if you're invested, if you're engaged. You're not talking. I don't know what you're getting out of this. And they're like, I'm tired. We're just tired. By the end of the week, they have, they're doing their internships. And so they're at their schools online virtually, all day. So it's like they have class and then a full day of internship, a full day of class. So I know my students don't like it. I know they prefer to be face-to-face. My undergrads prefer to be face-to-face. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think faculty, we are doing the best that we can in this environment. And just like Dr. McAvoy said, the quality is still there. They're getting the expertise. I just don't know about, that engagement piece in this environment.
Well, one thing I'm exceptionally grateful for is just how much grace my students have given me in the classroom and how much flexibility they've shown. This is really hard, y'all. To the students watching this, you have to understand very rarely, and this is a dirty secret of higher education, but very rarely are professors actually taught how to teach in their graduate programs. So we're often learning through programs like the one Dr. Griffin mentioned, where this is how you learn, a summer boot camp, if you will, about how to teach online. We had one of those at Davidson as well. It was exceptional and helped us really learn how to do this. But even still, a lot of what we're doing in the classroom, we're having to change on the fly because it's a brave new world of online education for many of us. I just want to thank the students for giving us that grace to be willing to be flexible with us, to be willing to sort of change course with us. Know that I will always try to give you grace as well if an assignment's not working. And let's check in. And I think a lot of faculty are beginning to do this if they haven't already. it's best practices to check in with your students all the time and figure out what's working or what's not. Well, it's especially important to do that now. And if anything, I think I can say that I've been more reflective as a faculty member and as a teacher this semester than ever before, because I can see some things just not working and I want to find a way to make them work.
All right, and then kind of moving back, how will a prolonged disruption to higher education and K-12 schooling affect students themselves, and how are different students disproportionately affected by this? We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but if anyone had any other thoughts on that.
How is it, could you repeat the question, Holly? I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, so how will this disruption affect students, and how are different students disproportionately affected?
Gotcha, thanks.
You know,
No, I insist, Dr. Griffin, go for it.
you know, just from a counseling perspective, one of the things that we talk about outside of academics, we talked about that, but social learning, I think, is going to be impacted because, and this is K through 12, I'm really referring to, students are not getting that social engagement that they normally would get. And so younger kids, where they're learning how to interact with others, how to treat others, I think it looks different. And if they are in families where they do not have opportunities to, be with other kids in the neighborhood, or have that opportunity to engage with others on their age level, I think we're going to see that coming through. I hear in talking to, friends, and I hear stories of things that their kids are doing, or maybe they're more engaged in adult conversations now, things that they wouldn't be if they were with their friends. So I think that social piece is something that we're going to have to really think about and explore and address. And as I told my students, and thinking about the lifespan development too, in child and adolescent development, those milestones that have been researched for decades, where, those markers where kids are supposed to be, I think those are going to change too. And we're going to have to really redefine, what child and adolescent development looks like post-COVID, after all of this time when we're being in this isolation.
All right.
Oh, sorry. I just think that there's just so much unknown right now. I think that that's what we're just sitting in a big, moment of unknown. We don't know to what extent students are socializing in the neighborhood or not, or having, adult supervision, or, there's just how many, are kids reading books? I don't know. Like, these schools haven't handed out books. So, there's just some basic stuff that, I think that there's just going to be a big unknown gap in knowledge and social skills and I think just general well-being of young people.
I'm also exceptionally concerned about quote unquote non-traditional students who are not 18 to 22-year-olds living on a residential campus, or what we consider to be the traditional student population, working mothers, veterans, people who have to attend school part-time because they're working full-time. Those adult learners have a very different world now than they did 6 months ago, or 10 months ago. It is very, very difficult to go to a community college and enroll in a degree program if there's no childcare available. And right now, it's very hard to get childcare. It's very, very difficult to enroll in a program when you're worried about where your next paycheck is going to come from, because we have such high unemployment at this point. And so I worry a lot about my own students and the students at places like represented by the faculty on this panel, but I'm exceptionally worried about students at for-profit institutions, at community colleges, at open access institutions that are four-year institutions. I worry that they will be behind because of COVID-19, and that it will be very, very hard to catch those students up to make sure that they get the skills they need for the post-COVID economy.
I have a question for my education colleagues here, if I might. Dr. McAvoy, you talked about how much is unknown, and I've been wondering about research in the particular time that we are in right now. It's hard to do research when you're being isolated, for starters, and yet it's also critically important because so little is known. Are you seeing in your own work or in the work of your colleagues that their research is beginning to turn to some of these questions that we're raising here?
I think, yeah, there are some big funding agent or sources that have been incentivizing COVID studies. So the American Educational Research Association has money towards trying to understand schooling under COVID. The Spencer Foundation, which is a big funder of education research, has initiatives, did a big summer push for studies of COVID, particularly addressing inequality and high needs students. So I think there is work being done, and I know of research on higher education and online learning. And so I think it is being, yeah, there is work being done for sure.
The College Crisis Initiative is funded by a grant from the ECMC Foundation to track college and university reopening plans and just in general crises in higher education. We've now got data on testing. We've now got data on reopening plans. We expect in the next week to begin collecting data on reopening plans for K-12 institutions. We recently were part of a multi-institution study that shows that reopening college campuses in person led to 3,000 additional cases in counties across the country per day when those institutions were open in person. So the research is definitely happening on the macro level. I can't speak to the level of within the classroom as much, although I'm sure there are many, many fantastic educational scholars that are doing just
that. So the next question is kind of leading into our previous one. How can we balance physical health and well-being with the social, emotional, and intellectual needs of college students and younger children?
One of the things that I tell my college students is I give them instructions to continue to find or have fun in the ways that work. And so I always end a session or send a note about have socially distant fun, because we need that, especially for those who are more social, who need interaction, who need to be engaged. They need to find ways to do that in socially distant ways. And, right now I'm not doing counseling, but it's more of, I have a friend who has a daughter at a school. She's a freshman and it's so miserable for her. And, my heart hurts for her because, freshmen, on these college campuses are not getting the experiences that we had, what college freshmen should do and hang out and meet people. And that's all changed and that's hard. And that does weigh heavy on mental health. So we need to find a way to have these, I call them just socially distant activities, wear your mask, meet up outside, do something, kick a ball. I don't know what it is, but find ways to do that. And the same, it has to be the same for all of us, right? It's hard to sit on our, Zoom all day, meeting after meeting. I say that we should never schedule meetings back to back. 5 Zoom meetings in one day, that's 3 too many. So for us, for our own, mental well-being, we can't do that. And we definitely need to find ways for our kids to remain in activities. And, as I'm sitting here, I'm enjoying, seeing parents walk, and people on their bikes. And these are the things that we definitely need to continue to do in this environment. And it's going to be more difficult as the weather gets colder. There are some of us who don't like the cold. I'm sitting, like my scarf is on for a reason, it's like it's too early to turn on the heat, but I wish I had some heat. There's some of us who we don't like the cold, but we're going to have to go out and find ways to continue to enjoy life the way that it is right now, whatever that looks like. But I always stress, we have to do it in safe ways, get used to wearing the mask, get used to remaining 6 feet apart, So that's the way to, I think, address the mental health needs generally, like that's a broad blanket statement.
I'd like to add that an internet life is a life without boundaries. It can be, and it requires, if one's going to be healthy about it, one has got to set some boundaries. And we need to encourage our students to do that, our colleagues, but we also need to honor them and to try to allow people to have some boundaries and some healthy balance in their lives. And that may slow some things down if we're not going to just ask people to push on through and use every hour of their waking day to get something done. But I think that's the flip side of what Dr. Griffin was talking about. To be able to get outside, you've got to set aside that time. You've got to make it a priority, and you've got to shut some other things down.
Kind of moving back out to the actual decision-making process itself, who should have a seat at the table when making decisions about how to reopen schools? Should it be a family and student-centered decision, or should it be more based on the opinion of the administration? And how democratic, if democratic at all, should that decision to reopen be?
So, you can usually count on me to have the pro-democracy answer to things. But I have to say, I think that the pandemic, and there are some other issues in our country, that really brings into question the role of expertise, and when should we defer to experts, and when should we be calling upon the public to weigh in on things. And it's not to say that the public has no role to play in this, but this is what you're seeing play out in America in a lot, is a serious doubt of experts and expertise and scientific knowledge, and an intentional undermining of expertise. And one thing that I worry about is that much of the disagreement over this pandemic is a disagreement over who should we believe, and that makes democracy nearly impossible to deal with when we can't agree on who's the expert and what the facts are. So it puts, to say that we want the public to weigh in when the public has been manipulated in a lot of ways. It's hard. You now create so much distrust in each other, in our institutions, and in our experts, that I can't help but doubt whether a democratic solution would be a good solution, a good way to go. That said, though, of course we need to. The experts don't always have on the ground knowledge of what it's like to live in poverty in rural North Carolina. So those things have to be, taken up and into consideration. So policymakers have to sit between the experts and a lot of on the ground facts that experts don't always have. So that's a long-winded answer to say, I think that what I would like is for our democracy to figure out a way to trust one another again, and then I'm willing to have more democratic decision-making in our public institutions.
This has been called the first postmodern pandemic, and by that it is meant that in oversimplified postmodern perspective is to say that objectivity is not possible, that whenever somebody is presenting facts, like an expert is presenting facts, they're cherry picking those to present a certain perspective, and they're pushing an agenda. And that, if we just take our pandemic as being with that kind of a backdrop, and then you add sort of the active dividing of people be it from Russia or being it from people within our own country, the seeding of distrust makes our ability to handle this epidemic, any epidemic, exceedingly difficult. Probably the most basic principle of public health ethics is maintaining public trust, because without trust, you can't do anything. And if you have trust, well, you know, people will do most anything. So I think that's the challenge of our day is how do we establish that trust in this particular environment? And at UNC, the challenge is further complicated by the separation of authority and responsibility. There are those who have the authority to decide what is going to happen on campus, but they don't have the responsibility for making it happen. And that creates a real challenge for those who are implementing and where they have discretion to make decisions. There's much more that could be said about that, but I'll leave it there and perhaps pick it up later.
You know, from this question has been asked, I've been on like webinars before, we talk about this, who needs a seat at the table? And I've said this before, that the people who need to be at the table are often not at the table. And that is the problem too. And it's also a personal approach. Like, we all bring our own experiences to the table. And just like, you know, was mentioned before, if you never grew up in poverty, right? If you don't live in a rural area, then you don't know what it's like to be in that environment. And oftentimes those conversations won't be had if you don't have someone who can represent that person, that voice at the table. And that's, you know, I think what happened probably at UNC. That's one of the things that I mentioned. Even the students themselves mentioned that they didn't have a voice, you know, at the table. They didn't have a say in the decision making. And these, you know, groups are left out of the table, important stakeholders, families from different areas. And we often don't get the voices of the oppressed, right? Those are the voices not at the table. And, you know, the decision to reopen schools from parents, who's leading that? Which voices are speaking louder, right? My kids need to be back at school. Who's saying that? What are these decisions in that? And, you know, teachers are their voices at the table? You know, again, like I mentioned, my husband is a high school teacher and he's being asked to go back to schools, you know, in a few weeks. And I think, wasn't there just some outbreaks in some Durham public schools when there were no kids, just staff at the school? So, you know, where are the teachers' voices? Do they want to go back? Parents, again, where are their voices? And then even some students themselves, like some students, if you talk to them, they will say, I don't want to go back to school if I have to wear a mask all day, right? Do they understand what going back to school looks like? That's, you know, why I say that there's a lose-lose, because, you know, no matter what voice is at the table, I don't think that anyone's going to be able to come together, because we're all looking at it from our personal perspective. But that personal perspective is very, very important and also needs to be taken into consideration.
And then the next question is the work that educators and other educational staff, is the work that they're doing essential the same way that medical work is? And how does that affect our decisions about reopening these schools?
So I am of the view, and maybe this is just being self-important, but I'm of the view that the universities, colleges and universities play an essential role in helping society to adapt. Where COVID is probably one of our early experiences of what's going to become more frequent going forward. There will be other different kinds of emergencies. We've got all kinds of climate change things to think about. But we're going to be challenged to be changing quite a bit. And we need to be doing the kind of research that a few of you described. I guess it was Dr. McAvoy that described the kind of research that's being done within education, but also in public health and a few others, because we've got some heavy adapting to do. And it's not just adapting, but it's how to do things differently so that all voices, the important voices, are included in decisions. I don't, the word essential is such a loaded term, and it's kind of heard differently now in COVID than it was in the previous pandemic when we were preparing for pandemic influenza. But so that's why I say I feel kind of self-important as a professor saying that yes, professors are essential. So maybe I can take the edges off of that by saying that I think that it's really important that we engage in our society adapting to this and the coming emergencies.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I think as a country, America's greatest gifts to the world are Beyonce and the UNC system. And what I mean by that is not just Beyonce and the UNC system, but our cultural exports, our artists, our music, our movies, and our higher education system. And as the two great strengths of what it means to be an American, two great strengths of our country, they are going to have to play a role in any crisis that moves forward. And I think Dr. Thomas is exactly right that if there's a vaccine that comes for this COVID-19, as we all hope there will be and will be soon, it will be because researchers either trained at American universities or in conjunction with American universities or under the employment of American universities came up with that vaccine, right? If there is a future that we have as a country, and we've been around for a little while, I hope we'll be around for a little bit longer, it relies on a strong higher education system. So is being a professor essential? Maybe, maybe not. Is having a robust system of higher education essential for the future of this country? Absolutely, without a doubt.
Admit that when I read the question, I thought immediately of K-12 teachers and not higher education. And and my first read was, well, no, educators aren't exactly during a pandemic. The issues are life and death, and of course we want to prioritize our medical personnel. But at the same time, that it is a life and death situation when kids are home without food or adult supervision. That is life and death. And that's, and so is that the role of the teacher? I don't think that is the teacher's, they're not the ones that have to address that situation, but the state needs to recognize that there are life and death situations that are beyond the person with COVID, so that the situation is causing life and death situations we need a holistic, thoughtful approach to the state and to the country to address, all of those concerns.
I went to K-12 too, with education, and I thought about, how are we redefining what essential means? And, in this COVID, we have definitely redefined that from health workers, law enforcement, to we think about people who, run or work in the grocery stores, people who work at gas stations, people who do some of those things that we need, who we overlooked. Now they are considered essential workers because we need them to go to work so that we can continue to have our needs met, right? So that we can go buy our groceries and, get our gas to go to the beach or wherever we're going. And so we have redefined what essential means, but are they treated the same way? That's where the inequity is. And thinking about teachers were never seen as essential. We always had a love-hate relationship with our K-12 teachers, but now that these kids are at home, our teachers are needed. Like, you need to be in schools. We now put them in this higher status right? Which is where they should have always been. But, you know, are they still going to be, are they seen as babysitters? I need a place for my kids to go because I need to work, or I need someone else to teach them? Or are they seen as essential to relaying the information that is needed for kids to learn, right? So that they can then come to us on a college campus. And I think that's what's being, you know, I don't know, that's the puzzling piece. So I've always viewed teaching and education in a, you know, positive way. I think that we are all essential, whether we are K through 12 or on a college campus. But the question is, are we treated as such? Do they see us for the academic intellect that we bring to the table? You know, and I don't think that's what K through 12 teachers are getting in the conversation where, you know, people are saying that kids need to go to school. It's always, my kids need to be in school, right? My kids, you know, kids are least likely to get COVID, but the conversation stops at what happens if they pass it on to the adults who are working in the schools, right? Who then have to go home and maybe take care of aging adults who are at risk. And so in that light, they're not essential. They don't see them as essential, in my opinion. But again, that's my, you know, I have a personal stake in the matter, and that everyone in my family, for the most part, are educators.
And then our final question is, if you had to pick one positive thing that could come out of this pandemic, what would you say?
I gotta jump in here. I have always thought that our students, whether they be K-12 or in higher education or some, you know, alternative certification program, whatever form, I've always thought that our students are more resilient than many of us as faculty members or as teachers or as the students' families believed. And I am the one happy accident of this horrible pandemic for me has been to see just how resilient our students are. To see our students pushing through that 8:30 p.m. Thursday evening course, that discussion, you know, really trying so hard to keep that in-person college experience going by wearing masks everywhere they go, by social distancing, or as we say at Davidson, living the middle school dance life all day long, and being separate from each other. And I think there are lots of stories about students not taking COVID-19 restrictions seriously. I think that gets a lot of play in the media. But in the same vein, we've got students who are not only taking the restrictions seriously, but stepping up to lead their institutions through this issue. The team at the College Crisis Initiative is almost entirely a group of plucky 18 to 22-year-olds who are trying to fight this virus. At North Carolina A&T University, we've seen over the past week in multiple articles about how student leaders on that campus are driving forward voter registration efforts in the middle of this pandemic. Students, you all have to know that your resilience is inspiring to the rest of us, that what you can do to not just try to survive, but to thrive is going to push higher education and K-12 education further than it's ever been before and make really good things happen. So thank you for the work that you are doing.
I just want to piggyback on that because I got chills just yesterday. I sent a message to my students about their resiliency, right? And that's really huge. And to really think about how kids are resilient, and kids K through 12, and then our young adults and on college campuses. They are resilient. And I told them to really reflect on that. And so just to hear you talking about that in the ways that you see that, I think that's very powerful. And that message needs to get out to more students, to more people, that they are adapting. And you see it on, you know, the ways that they communicate, right? Snapchat. That's one thing about the pandemic. I had to join TikTok. I had to join these new social media platforms, Twitter, to figure out how to communicate, you know, with my students, young K through 12 and college level. And so I do see that resiliency. And one of the things that we do as adults, or I'm noticing, in my groups is that we may complain about it. And I think in our complaining about it, we then model for them how they should respond. Whereas, like you said, we need to be learning from them and then modifying our behavior and our thought processes around that. So that resiliency, I think, thank you for saying that.
I would offer, I'll say amen to those comments. But I'm not gonna use that as my one chip here. So what I want to mention is that I have noticed during this time much more frequent open discussions about mental health, and I'm thankful for that. I think it's an important skill. It's time that mental health come out of the closet, that we normalize those discussions, that we constantly encourage each other and encourage each other to check in on each other, to factor it in what all of us are experiencing, and which is not to say that we don't have a lot of work to do in mental health. We have a lot of work to do, but I feel like the conversation has opened up more because of what we're all dealing with together.
So I'll end with, so I think, that was all very helpful for generating my ideas, but I think one thing is that I'm struck by how creative, and maybe this is related to resilience, how creative people are in trying to find ways to connect with one another and take care of one another. And so and to figure out how to socialize, in a much simpler, smaller group. I think that there's just been a change in sort of friendships and families that is interesting, and I think in an overall positive way. And I'll say, not related to education, I think that the environment is really appreciative of this pandemic, and that we've slowed down as a society, and that has been good for the environment, and it's, I think, good for us as well in a lot of ways. But my hope is that this pandemic has made more clear to the world and Americans in particular about how our wealth inequality is really makes us suffer as a nation, and that that it has exposed some really serious cracks in society. And I hope that we have the political wherewithal to address those as we move forward and out, hopefully. Yeah.
All right, so we are right at the end of our prepared questions. We're now going to go into talking a little bit about some of the questions from our audience. You can type those into the Q&A dashboard, Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom dashboard. Our first question for Dr. Thomas: are there ways that a school can take elements like funding that lead to unethical decisions out of the decision process? It seemed as if when really important decisions needed to be made, that schools tended to cut out the structures they rely on, and went straight to hidden decisions made by flat or by new committees thrown together.
Yeah. There's a lot in that question. There's a question about economics. There's a question about decision-making processes and apparent secrecy, scrambling to create new processes. I'm not going to be able to address it all. I'm going to say that the economic issues do need to be kept in play, but it's best if they're kept in play on the table and not under the table. If we can know that they're in play, and this is what the chancellor or the president or whoever is, or the principal is dealing with, I think that's the important thing, that transparency. In terms of the decision-making processes, this has been one of the things that I have been working on at UNC. Even though I'm an epidemiologist, I have been exercising my voice as the ethicist on campus, because there are plenty of other epidemiologists to confer with. And in that role, I have been encouraging the chancellor and provost and others to have processes that do not look secret, that build trust. And I have not been satisfied in all that I have seen. There have been some things done that I think are good steps, but there is still a lot of distrust. And I think that part of the secrecy comes from a point that I made earlier about the difference between where the authority lies and where the responsibilities lie. And the gap between those two, it makes it hard to be truly transparent.
Our next question is, I've seen some arguments that schools should return to in-person instruction as soon as possible because of the disparate impact on people of color and low-income students, but COVID-19 also disproportionately impacts these same groups. Dr. Marsicano, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier in the session that I thought that we needed a sort of a bailout for educational institutions for them to be able to provide the high level of testing they need. I want to clarify, not before K-12 gets the money, because of exactly this issue. There are too many students of color, too many low-income students for whom the only place where they get a warm meal during the day is in their school. The place where they get the best medical care that they can possibly receive is in their school. And so I am sympathetic to the arguments about making sure that we return to in-person instruction as soon as possible, especially at the K-12 level, because of these equity issues. I'm sympathetic to those arguments. However, I have to say there are so many other concerns to be considered as well when it comes to at home. One of the things Dr. McAvoy mentioned early in the session is that there are stories of parents being upset at teachers for having a crucifix or talking about Black Lives Matter, and teachers not being able to see the students because the students have their screens off. There are also stories on the flip side here that suggest that teachers are able to see when something bad is going on in the home and be able to get students the help they need when those cameras are on, in those few cases where the cameras are on. So I don't know that there is a clear, cut and dry answer as to what is best for students of color and for low-income students. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to give a best answer, but I know that we don't have consensus on this because so many different school districts are choosing different options. So many different colleges are choosing different options. If there was one clear right answer, we'd all have a pretty close to a similar one. So I'm certainly sympathetic to those who argue we need to get in-person instruction as soon as possible to support those students, even in spite of the fact that there is major outbreaks and major negative health outcomes for students and the families who fall under those categories. In fact, perhaps we should do that because of the fact that schools can be the first touch point for medical care for so many students.
And before we move on, does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to that?
Sorry, sorry, this may be Dr. Thomas's expertise, but I'll say that, when the question suggests that there's something about people of color that makes them disproportionately impacted by COVID, but there's a lot we don't know about why that is, and it could be the types of jobs or the risks that they themselves have to take on in society. And so, this is not whether or not students come back to school, that it's just being back in school in and of itself doesn't necessarily put you at a higher risk versus being at home or being at work. So I just wanted to point out that we have, the question is kind of who should come back to school and when, but I think that the question also points to some inequities in society that are different than just racial categories, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And to clarify, I didn't mean to suggest that there is a racial difference in medically how COVID-19 affects people. I certainly meant to point out exactly those inequities, that because of those inequities in society, because of jobs, because of systemic racism around that has resulted in people of color being disproportionately low income, that means that there's not as great medical care in a lot of communities. And schools can be the first touch point for some of that medical care. So there is, I am saying I'm sympathetic to that argument, but I agree with you, Dr. McAvoy. I did not mean to suggest, or I hope no one is suggesting that there are medical differences in take-up rates based on race, which is, as we know, a social construct.
All right, and then our next question is, in your view, has the pandemic placed too much pressure on K-12 schools and perhaps institutions of higher education to serve functions that are beyond pedagogy and formation? It can feel at times like we expect schools to solve all of our social, political, and policy woes.
Go ahead, Dr. Griffin.
You know, you probably have more insight to add to that. I was just going to say that that's a great question. And thinking about the work that I do in the research with school, family, community partnerships, I have long been an advocate, and so have others in this who do this type of work and research this type of work, about the role of communities in addressing some of the needs in schools. Excuse me. But you know, if school or, you know, do we have too much being placed on schools? I think that we are asking a lot of, you know, for K-12 schools to come and make this decision when a lot of the schools, you know, they also are low resourced, right? And so we're asking them to really meet the needs of, you know, populations when even before COVID, that was already hard to do. And so we need to take into account the inequities that were already in existence before COVID when we think about, you know, what schools can do. And again, from a personal perspective, you know, I live in Durham, you know, my kids, well, one went through and one is currently in Durham public schools. And I really applaud how they have really responded to the needs of the students in our city. That you mentioned distribution of food and other basic needs. I think that that's something that is needed, they recognize and really responded to. And I think that is a responsibility of schools, that we need to look beyond academics as well, and how we can also meet other needs of students. So, you know, that's a tough question. I think that there's pressure and that they need to meet the needs of all of their students. And schools can be very diverse, meaning that they have low income populations, you know, wealthy students who are attending schools. And so meeting the needs of all of that is difficult, but I am happy with the way that some schools have responded to addressing the needs of our most vulnerable populations. And I'm just speaking from Durham because I am a resident and I know what they have done to really help those communities in need.
I'll just echo the exact same sentiment. Basically, I don't think the pandemic has put too much pressure on K-12 schools. I think that we already were putting too much pressure on K-12 schools, and not in the way, and I think more specifically, pressure on teachers to take on the role of nurse, counselor, teacher, parent, social worker, etc. But schools as an institution, should they be a place that serves students sort of wrap around, I think, you know, with food and medical care. I mean, they're a great institution because they touch so many families, but we don't fund and design them in a way to meet all of those needs, yet we still expect them to sort of play that role. So I would like us to reimagine schools in a way that they would do that, in which trained people are doing the medical care and the counseling and the services, and not just telling teachers you need to take more and more on. But I think that the pandemic has certainly, as I said earlier, highlighted that we as a country have way too many people living in poverty. There are way too many children. There should be 0 children living in poverty, but it's shameful. And I hope that America is seeing, you know, what we've created prior to the pandemic.
I heard recently that the word apocalypse, now we don't want to end on that word, but that the word apocalypse translated from its origins, are they Greek, are similar to an uncovering, not an end of things, but an uncovering of how things are. And if that's the way that we are to hear that word, then it makes sense that COVID is uncovering a lot of things right now. It's uncovering how our institutions are working and how they are not working. And to go back and double dip on this earlier question about the one positive thing that we would take away, I'm going to take a second one. And it is this uncovering and this, let's call it an opportunity, if not a necessity, to acknowledge these deficits and to find new ways and to dig a little deeper for our creativity, to consider how we are treating our essential populations. Are we treating them essentially? And what does it look like to do that? Where we have talked about not putting so much weight on schools, and a month ago we were talking about not putting so much weight on the institution of police. Where we're asking the wrong institutions to do things that need to be done. So how should they be done?
Our tagline at C2I is crisis breeds innovation. And I think what we all sort of hope here is that this crisis will certainly allow us to come up with new ideas that challenge the 1,000-year-old model of the university or the 100-year-old model of the modern public school. We're going to need to come up with new ideas. The challenges of the future do not necessarily look like the challenges of the past. And so there's a strong hope that I have that we will rise to the challenge, students, faculty, staff, local stakeholders, government leaders, that we will all together be able to jointly figure out what is next for education. And I'm hopeful it'll be a bright future because it's taken us pretty far so far.
We just need the right people at the table to do so.
100%, completely agree.
All right, we are right up at the end of our time, unfortunately. But before we go, I want to thank all of you again for taking the time out of your day to join us. I think it was a really great discussion. Certainly gave me a lot to think about, and I'm sure the rest of our audience as well. And then I also want to say thank you again to all of our audience members who tuned in tonight. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their week.
Wait, can we thank Nahali for the excellent job she's done as a moderator? Audience and panelists, I hope you'll join me in applauding her. It's not easy to be an undergraduate and to negotiate a conversation with four folks, at least one of which is full of hot air. So you did a fantastic job, Nahali. Well done.
Thank you.